Good morning and welcome. I'm Joe Kane, Director of Broadband and Spectrum Policy here at ITIF. Thank you for joining us for this panel discussion on the changing competitive landscape in broadband and video. It's an understatement to say that these markets have changed in recent years and continue to change rapidly. The broadband market today is a far cry from the days of siloed single technology markets we once knew. We've now had rapidly expanding fiber and cable footprints competing with 5G fixed wireless and satellite services that are reaching places once thought unreachable. Consumers now expect seamless, high-speed connectivity everywhere, and they're getting it. But while the market has evolved, many of the governing rules are stuck in the past, and that mismatch can hold back competition, innovation, and investment that would benefit consumers. To discuss all this, we've gathered a terrific panel to explore where the market is headed and what smart policy should look like. Our panelists' full bios are on our website, so I'll just briefly introduce them here. First, we have Svetlana Gans, who is a partner at Gibson, Dunn & Crutcher, where she focuses on FTC and DOJ antitrust division matters. She was also FTC Chief of Staff in the first Trump administration and a senior advisor to acting FTC Chairman Maureen Olhausen. Next, we have Blair Levin, who is non-resident senior fellow at the Metropolitan Policy Program at the Brookings Institution and a policy advisor to New Street Research. Blair was also Chief of Staff to FCC Chairman Reed Hundt. Next, we have Mike O'Reilly, who is president of MP O'Reilly Consulting, Inc. He was an FCC commissioner from 2013 to 2020, and before that, he spent 20 years on Capitol Hill in both the House and the Senate, ending as policy advisor to the Senate Republican whip. And finally, last but not least, Shane Tews, who is a visiting fellow at the American Enterprise Institute's Center for Internet Communications and Technology Policy. She is also vice chair of the board of directors at the Internet Education Foundation and was previously vice president of global policy for VeriSign. So thank you to all of our panelists for joining. I'm going to pose some questions to the panelists first, but we're going to leave some time at the end for audience questions. So throughout the discussion, please submit your questions with the Slido link that's in the video description, and we'll try to answer as many as possible. So let's just jump right in. We're talking about the changes in this marketplace. So I wonder if we could maybe start by looking backwards, and if I could get some of you to give a broad strokes description of what was the internet like when you started working in this field, both from a technical and a competition perspective. And maybe we go to Blair first on that.
Thank you very much, Joe, and a pleasure to be with everyone. So when I got to the FCC in 1993, as you mentioned, the markets were characterized by single-purpose analog networks. Most multi-channel video was delivered by the cable network because the program access rules of the 92 Act were just starting to kick in, enabling DBS to come in. There was an analog voice network characterized by the local exchange carriers. There was just a duopoly in wireless, also analog. And there was a long-distance industry. But they did not compete with each other because, as you said, they were siloed. The fundamental idea of what we were trying to do at the FCC, and it was implicit in the 96 Act, but it was very clear to both Reed Hundt and Al Gore, was to transform all networks into multi-purpose digital networks so that voice, video, and data could be carried over every network, and to increase the competitive intensity. So we did a number of things to do that, some of which are well known, some of which are forgotten, some of which should be forgotten, some of which worked, some of which didn't. But I'll mention a few things because there's a view like if you just let everybody do everything, it'll be great. That probably wasn't the case. One of the most important things we did was to reduce the inter-carrier compensation for wireless to terminate calls on the wired network. The wired guys at that time were charging an enormous amount. And when we did that, wireless really took off. Another thing we did was wireless number portability, without which increased friction for consumers to churn. So there were a number of things, but I would simply end this by noting that in those days, we worried about the cost of long distance. I don't know that anyone is worried about the cost of long distance in the last few years, or even the cost of local voice service. And, Kevin Martin famously in the early part of the decade was saying that we should have simply a la carte in video. We're not quite doing what he said, but at the end of the day, the video market is moving that direction. So from a perspective of 1993, competition is greatly enhanced. But whether that will continue or not, I guess we'll be talking about in this panel.
Yeah, thank you. Shane, can you add your view to that?
Yeah, as somebody who worked in the domain name addressing business for 12 years, just trying to explain to people how the internet connected back in that day was a real challenge. A lot of times I would be just known as internet girl on the hill. I would just show up and explain the baseline. So some of the things that we really are still not struggling as much with, but are still important, are latency and reliability. It was Richard Bennett who taught me that every time I was downloading a website, I should not be frustrated with the connection. It was probably all the ads that were loading on the side. So we've gotten a little better about things around there, but it was, we were building it as it was going along, and I have to say it always worked magically. And I want to thank all the engineers who did all that work, because if it was up to me, it wouldn't have happened.
Yeah, that's fascinating.
Can I only add to that a little bit and suggest, when I got into the field, may have been around the same time that, in the policy space that Blair was taking off at the FCC. I obviously entered at a much lower level, but in the early 90s, one thing to keep in mind is the internet was somewhat separated between the consumer side and the business side. And the consumer side was really driven dial-up, walled gardens, depending on what your service it was. And then on the business side, you had a lot of proprietary offerings that you might see on Wall Street today for different screens and things of that nature. So it was a really separate universe that has merged over time to make the internet, as dynamic as possible. But it was in the early days, and I can remember in college we didn't really have anything related to the internet. So it has changed dramatically in the last number of years.
Yeah, thank you. And I think one of the biggest changes there has been sort of the speeds. And I always think it's interesting that there's both kind of an FCC push for faster speeds, and then also ISPs who, in their marketing, they want you to get the faster and faster speed tier. And I wonder if I could get your thoughts on what is a good or a fast broadband speed today, and how should that inform how we think about new technologies like the sort of fixed wireless or LEO satellites, and whether they operate as substitutes for traditional wireline. Maybe, Mike, we go back to you on that first.
Sure. I'm happy to start and let others jump in. Look, I think that good internet, or however you want to phrase it, is what's necessary for the consumer's experience. What do they need to make their offering or their experience as dynamic as possible? We try to sell, the marketing, as you mentioned, tries to sell this image that everyone needs some certain minimum level, a gig. Everyone has to have a gig or 10 gig or something. And it's really the difference between, we try to sell these rocket ships when most people really need a bicycle or maybe a moped or maybe, a town car. What you need for the experience, for what services that you really want to experience, are much lower than what everyone would like you to buy. And so to your heart of your question, I believe and have for a long time, and have made this viewpoint, I think it's now common sense, that other technologies, while they may not be as dynamic in the capabilities or capacity of fiber, are just as relevant for the marketplace. So fixed wireless, the LEO satellites absolutely are substitutes. And we cannot forget the cable industry, which has brought, numerous innovations over the years and competes broadly with fiber for all of the different consumer advantages that are out there. And I saw something from fiber yesterday, a marketing piece, and how cable was inferior. And it just is really just about marketing and how they can try and prop themselves up in a DC perspective, because the consumer doesn't care, in my mind. And if you talk to enough consumers, they don't care what the technology is. They just want it to work when they need it to work and for the services they want it to work for. Zoom is really a small capacity service, and there's very little, unless you're in the high speed business side of the equation, that you need something much different than that. So I absolutely believe it's certainly in the consumer marketplace and most small businesses that all of these other technologies are all competing against each other going forward.
Yeah, I would echo that. I'd say that they're going to my kind of earlier comment of sometimes it's bad configurations. You actually have your speed is fine. And then I'm one of those people that will want to like go back and like put in the comments, like the problems that people are having with the website, which is a consumer issue. So I'm like, this is why people are, but they'll think it's just speed. They think that they are not getting enough speed from their provider or whatever their provider may be. But a lot of times it's a matter of making sure that the information is configured right.
So I have a slightly different point of view. My basic perspective is that we should have a speed which are ahead of the applications. We had exactly the opposite for the first, roughly speaking, 20 years of the internet. That is to say, the lack of speed was holding back applications. When I was doing the National Broadband Plan in 2009 and 10, the average speed was 4 down. But there are two separate problems that we should be thinking about. One is what do consumers need? And that should be basically measured by what are consumers doing? What's the average speed? And now, of course, it was 4 or 15 years ago. Now the average download speed is somewhere between, I think, 150 and 250 down. But the other thing is, from a country's perspective, I think you need to have speeds which are well in excess of what consumers need for some portion of the population, so that people start to develop applications that take advantage of that extra power. And when I was doing the National Broadband Plan, one of the concerns we had was that whereas we were kind of in this prisoner's dilemma where cable was, shall we say, the Nordstroms, and telcos with DSLs were the Walmart, and they kind of compete, but they kind of didn't. But there was no incentive to increase the speeds because that requires capital. And if there are only two choices, and you just make the choice, but neither one has an incentive to invest. And that's out of those discussions came Google Fiber, which I think really opened up the market. And what we were worried about was that in Korea and in France and in China and other places, they were building a lot more fiber, but we wanted to have kind of a market-based mechanism because we couldn't regulate people to build fiber. But it was really Google Fiber which kind of killed the Wall Street's view of the Verizon Fios investment, which was don't do it, to, oh my God, we have to do it. And so now I think we have, I agree with Mike in part, which is a lot of consumers are buying more than they need, but I'm not challenging that judgment. I'm just saying what the consumer needs and what the country needs are kind of two different things, but ought to be viewed as both what's adequate for all the known purposes, but also what's enables innovation and disruption for other purposes.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, that we want to keep the investment growing alongside the consumer uses, so that we do have people building more and more.
Can I just say on behalf of Wall Street, they don't want the investment to keep growing.
They don't want the investment? Well, that's a good question. How do we get the...
I work on Wall Street. Everybody in Washington says, Wall Street just wants to invest. No, they want their money back. When companies like Verizon in 2005 say we're going to invest a lot in fiber, what happens to the stock? It's not good, right? So anyway, but what you want is competition and market mechanisms which drive the necessary investment.
Right. Yeah, and I think that's a good segue into our next topic about sort of the competition space here, is that people, whether these ISPs want to be investing or not, I think to stay in business with so many other technologies coming into play, and just increasing growth of the technologies that were already there, the competition has really heated up. And so I wonder how, maybe we go to Svetlana first on this, because I think you have a lot of experience in the competition space here. How should we think about competition in broadband? Is it just about sort of number of competitors? And then does competition under the antitrust laws mean something different from how the average consumer would think about it? Or maybe we'll also talk about how the FCC thinks about it.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much, Joe, for having me. And thank you to your team for facilitating today's great discussion with our esteemed panel. So the mere counting of the number of providers does not necessarily answer the question on whether markets are competitive and how well consumers might be served in those markets. The antitrust laws look at competition from both a product and geographic market perspective. And of course, consumer choice is paramount in all of those analyses. Under the antitrust laws, the first step is to identify the relevant market. So in this case, the relevant market for broadband services. Under this analysis, a relevant market for a service would consist of services sold in competition with that service, such that a provider could profitably increase price without consumers switching to another provider. So, for example, if consumers would switch to another service, thereby preventing the providers from increasing the price in the first place, then those services would be included in the definition of a relevant product market under the antitrust laws. In the case of broadband internet access, for example, the analysis of last mile competition frequently centers around cable, DSL, and fiber wireline technologies, but services need not necessarily be perfect substitutes for each other to be included in the same relevant market. If consumers can switch to a wireless broadband service, it may be considered a competitive alternative and counted as part of the relevant product market. The antitrust laws also look at geographic market. On the question of whether markets are operating competitively, courts look to a variety of factors beyond consumer price. Courts say that competition is about enhancing consumer choice, and in that choice comes all of the benefits of the bargains, including price. So that would also include quality, technological innovation, service safety, and durability. And strong consumer protections and privacy protections can also be a competitive differentiator from a consumer point of view. Looking at quality and innovation in the broadband space, internet speeds today are 20 times faster than what they were when the FCC launched its national broadcast plan in 2010, something that Blair talked about. And internet speeds continue to increase by approximately 30%. In fact, for an international comparison, the average median download speed of other G8 nations was where the United States was 4 years ago. So you could see that our markets are operating more competitively in terms of service quality than international markets. And I hope we'll get to this later on, but Blair and everyone mentioned about the technological convergence and how new players are entering the home broadband market. Consumers have a lot of options right now, telcos and fiber and satellite. And within each mode, we're seeing competition between numerous providers, including AT&T, Verizon, Google, Comcast, Amazon, and others. So hopefully we'll talk a little bit about the regulatory regimes and how they may be different or similar depending on where you are in the marketplace. But antitrust does look at all criteria of product quality and service from a consumer perspective.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. Mike, can you chime in on sort of how that jives with how the FCC thinks about competition?
Well, absolutely. I agree with everything that was just said and very thoughtful. But I think the commission, reality is that there's kind of two stories going on. One is that in the vast number of geographic markets, there is wide competition between a number of different players, and the technologies are fighting it out. There's the universe separate, where in the unserved market or in the sparsely populated areas, you may have one provider that really has capabilities, and that's why we have a number of subsidy programs, like the BEAD program is trying to build some of those marketplaces where competition can't develop or hasn't been able to develop, and we're trying to figure out how to subsidize that universe. Actually, I'm working on the other side of the equation, is to make sure that the BEAD dollars aren't wasted and the government actually gets money back. We don't overspend in that universe. I'd like to see us claw back some of that money, but that's the kind of dynamic the commission is looking at. You've got the universe where there's no competition, and the rest of the Americas has, consumers have 5-6 different providers that are all chomping at the bit for their subscription-based and getting attention from the consumer. So I think that's a wonderful universe. It has developed, somewhat by marketing and some of it by actual, diving in. LEO satellites are taking off. They're, 3 years ago, I was talking about LEO satellites. 5 years ago, I was talking about LEO satellites. And now we're really there where people are accepting them. Fixed wireless the same way. And cable has been, as Rita talked about, as Blair has talked about recently, have been offering services for quite a long time and provide full services in competition with the fiber provider. So when we talk about, the FCC studying what's the marketplace for broadband services, I think it's very dynamic and very bright for the vast number of markets in America today.
I know I'm not the moderator, but can I just ask a quick question?
Go for it.
The 80% of America that lives in either urban or kind of suburban areas, not rural areas, do you think that satellite is a real competitor and that fixed wireless is a real competitor? Because it doesn't show up in the numbers.
Yeah, if you're asking me, I absolutely agree. If you ask consumers, if you talk about experience, it goes back to our first question. What is good internet? What do you need it for, the services you're asking for? It's different, as you know well, and I think that might be the harder question, between a consumer service and a business service. And some consumer services bleed into that universe depending on what they're offering. But we've had this conversation of what's the appropriate speeds at the commission. What does it have to be? Does it have to,
I think it's a different point, which is satellite capacity and fixed wireless spectrum capacity it's not economic to serve folks, which are most Americans. There's one of the key debates on Wall Street is how much fixed wireless will penetrate. And there are those who believe it's been growing, it's slowing down. There are some who believe it's going to flatten. Some believe it's going to go down. Some believe it's going to continue to go up. That's a good debate to have. But I'm just saying that from the suburban and urban point of view, there's about, roughly speaking, 15% of the population that's mobile only. But that's almost all low income. That's just an economic, they don't have an option.
Sure.
It's not about competition. For most Americans, the choice is really two, I think. But you're disagreeing, I think.
No, I do, and you're asking the question. Can satellite and fixed wireless handle capacity? Can they serve an entire marketplace? That's different than whether the offering that they have. If there's only one consumer that subscribes to fixed wireless or to a LEO satellite service, do I think that is comparable to what the experience that a consumer may have from cable or fiber? I would say yes. I think that they can get a experience on the same. It's different whether they can handle 200,000, 300,000, 400,000 in a marketplace, or defining what it would be. That's kind of a capacity issue, not of whether the technology can be a substitute.
Yeah, but again, from a kind of a Wall Street perspective, I don't know anyone on Wall Street who thinks that LEO is a competitor to Wireline in urban and suburban areas.
Sure, but Blair, wouldn't you say that probably in the more urban and suburban areas, those are also places that have at least two Wireline choices?
Yeah, they have two Wireline. That's right.
Yeah,
they do.
And I think when we go back to what
some of them have three.
Right. You're going to see overbuilding, and you're seeing that today, where 4 or 5 wireless, fixed. Sorry.
That's pretty rare.
5 fiber guys are getting into the same marketplaces. I think of Phoenix and a couple other markets where you're seeing just a dynamic growth to try and steal market share.
Yeah, there are some places that do that, but that's far from the majority.
True.
I guess as somebody from the Midwest, I should be appreciative of all of those Wall Street people who decided to go buy their third house in Montana. So they finally realized that something needed to exist other than fiber, and 5G wireless and satellites have really, they're a great way to access the market that, candidly, you just explained it, Blair, nobody was looking at it. And people do live out there and they do need connectivity. So I think
there's also a lot more spectrum available.
Well, so when we talk about broadband competition, we remember that what matters, as Svetlana was talking about, is the outcome to the consumers. Per megabit, we're seeing, the speeds are increasing, as well as the price is, we have great price points for people to look at these things. There's new technologies that are coming online. We mentioned fiber, we've got fixed wireless, we've got satellites. These are giving families and individuals more choices than ever before. And this is the free market at work. So our job isn't to pick winners or to regulate yesterday's technologies, but to encourage the environment to say that we open enough investment and innovation and competition to flourish. And this is great on competition on cost, quality, and service, but let's let the consumers decide.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And I think let's try to get more specific here on the competition front, with maybe the difference of opinion that I think some have seen between Commissioner Gail Slater's statement on the U.S. Cellular T-Mobile merger and that of Chairman Brendan Carr of the FCC. I wonder if anyone, maybe Svetlana, do you have a take on what you make of that, or if we can sort of talk more generally about that side of the market?
Yeah, sure. Happy to kick things off. I don't think there was necessarily a difference of opinion on the market competition front. AAG Slater discussed how the DOJ went through their analytical framework and analysis of the relevant market. And at the end of the day, at least to the DOJ, the analysis made clear that due in part to its limited regional footprint and unique structural limitations, U.S. Cellular simply could not keep up with the escalating cost of capital investments and technology required to compete vigorously in the relevant market. And because of that, it was not competitively significant in the long term. In contrast, T-Mobile publicly committed that it will integrate the two networks in a way that provides U.S. Cellular customers with faster data speeds. And, as Shane mentioned, it's really about consumer functionality and the consumer benefit. So on the competition grounds, I think some facts were problematic for her, but overall, based on the competitive analysis, she thought consumers would be better off than worse off for the deal. I think she was troubled, however, by the continued consolidation of spectrum. The DOJ investigated these spectrum transfers and concluded that they would not result in sufficient harm to competition to warrant an enforcement action at this point, but she recognized the importance of keeping an eye on the market to ascertain the risks to future competition to further spectrum aggregation. I'm not an FCC specialist, but my understanding is that Chair Carr is also similarly concerned about spectrum availability and has written Congress to free up more spectrum and to renew FCC's auction authority to free up more spectrum, which President Trump recently authorized through the One Big Beautiful Bill. So I don't necessarily think it was a difference of opinion, as the listeners know that DOJ and FCC also have different competition criteria in their merger analysis. So, I defer to my FCC colleagues on the call on the spectrum issue, but I think from the antitrust side, it was just insufficient for a federal case.
Yeah, that's really interesting, especially the spectrum policy. But I think, Blair, you have maybe a forward-looking take on.
I have a differential. I have both a backward and a forward-looking view. The backward-looking view is there was a disagreement between the FCC and the DOJ as to the T-Mobile Sprint deal, where the FCC said we're basically fine with it with no conditions. The DOJ, this is back in 2019. The DOJ said we'll only allow the deal if there's a new fourth competitor, and that led to a complicated consent decree in which Dish was essentially created to be a fourth competitor. Looking forward, very timely, I think there was a profound disagreement between the DOJ, and I think Gail was reflecting the staff point of view, and the FCC. The FCC is fine with 3. The DOJ wants 4. The problem is it's not clear who the fourth is going to be. And as of this morning, there was an announcement that Dish is going to be selling a lot of spectrum to AT&T, and it's not, and then entering into a hybrid MVNO deal. And so it won't really be a facilities-based competitor, but they will still be offering a service. The DOJ is going to be tested on this because that transaction is going to have to be approved by both the FCC and the DOJ. I have no doubt that the FCC will approve the deal. But, if you read the statement that Gail put out, there might be a question as to whether she will approve that deal. At the end of the day, I would predict she will approve the deal. We can go into that. But I do think there was a very significant disagreement about that. But spectrum, simply asking for more spectrum that will then be split up between the top 3 is very different than saying we need to make sure that there's at least 4 with adequate spectrum to provide the mobile service.
Yeah, Mike, can I bring you in there? What do you think about that?
Yeah, I actually agree with Blair a lot on this. I read the AG's comments to be somewhat protective of Dish's offering and hope that it may still be the fourth wireless provider in America. And that's to be determined. Let the market play that out. I'm not sure today's sale is going to undercut that directly. We'll find that out as more details play out. But so I read that to be like, a statement from DOJ to be careful. They were ones who, as Blair indicated, crafted a very complicated structure for the relationship between T-Mobile and Dish. And we've seen how some of that has gone so far and how the market's been receptive or not receptive. But that wasn't an FCC play. I think Chairman Carr is saying, I want spectrum to be available. The harder part is what, going forward, is who are going to be the players. If, the pie is shrinking, there's no more very few regional players anymore. The small players are probably not going to grow into major players. So we're going to have three very strong nationwide providers for wireless service. And then the question is what happens to Dish, whether it can grow or not. We're hopeful that it can, but we'll just see how the market treats it. And I think DOJ was signaling, hey, we want to be careful in terms of how you treat it going forward. Kind of a signal to the FCC that we're watching this. But I don't, to Blair's point, I don't know how the DOJ can block the sale of spectrum that was announced this morning. There are very few other options for sales of spectrum in auctions, going forward. So the big three are in rightfully so, going to accumulate more spectrum in auctions and have deals to increase their portfolios to add services that consumers want. That's a good thing. And then the question becomes, how does the market treat Dish? I hope there's a future and we'll be receptive going forward, but we'll just have to see.
I would just add that we need to have better spectrum use that matches the newer technology's capabilities. So the guardrails that we have of old, we need to think about how we're doing that. I think we need to. I'm glad that we finally got spectrum auction back in Congress, so we can be thinking about this from a market perspective. But we also need to be thinking about it from an engineering and technology spectrum. Are we actually using our spectrum to its best current use or capability?
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And let's drill down a little bit more on that, because we talked a lot about the convergence of different technologies that are all providing broadband service, which from a consumer's perspective is often, you don't care what technology is doing it, you just care that you have it. But there are different regulatory regimes behind that. There's the different spectrum, whether there's enough spectrum available, what are the different spectrum rules for fixed wireless versus LEO satellites. If you're a wireless provider, we have NEPA rules for your deployments and that kind of thing. If you're a wireline provider, you have to get access to poles and rights of way and dig trenches and that kind of thing. And I wonder are there ways that you see these regulations getting in the way of the consumer benefits from broadband competition, either from just the fact that they exist, or if they're creating kind of an unlevel playing field where there's one technology that's subject to more regulatory requirements than its competitors?
I think Chairman Carr's delete was heading in that direction, where we need to be looking at the range of the legacy issues that certain people, especially like the broadcasters, are having to manage that others do not, as well as the proposed regulations going forward. That we look at this from a new scope, and we've got to really untangle all of that underbrush that is keeping people from being able to compete on a better field.
Yeah, I agree with Shane on that. Absolutely. I think his recent talk about Build America is an effort to apply reg relief in NEPA and in building broadband networks across the state, and depending on whichever technology. So I don't think there's one technology that's getting treated differently. I think he's going after all of them and saying, what barriers can we lower? And you went through a number of different barriers that exist today. How can we solve some of those for everybody? If you need pole attachment fixes, we absolutely need to tackle that issue. We need spectrum issues. We got to solve some of those issues. So each category, in my mind, because of the technology, the underlying technology is being addressed. And we're going to let them, fight it out in the marketplace as best as possible and remove these other barriers that shouldn't be there in the first place.
If I could just add a slightly different point of view, again, reflecting how I spend my day talking to Wall Street, I'm not disagreeing as a matter of policy with what Carr did. I just think there are two things that will matter, but they're very incremental. One is the pole attachments and the other is the copper retirement. Again, I'm not disagreeing with it. I'm just saying that will have almost no impact. They're good things to do, it'll have absolutely no impact on, or not no impact, but very marginal impact. There is nobody who is on Wall Street who is saying, as a result of this, we're going to invest a lot more in terms of like quarterly calls. It's just not an issue. Nobody cared about it. Do you know what the biggest thing Wall Street is spending money on right now? Stock buybacks. July was a record July, and this year I think is the largest amount of stock buybacks since 2005. So again, not disagreeing with the policy, but the notion, what drove investment? What drove investment was the change in from 2007, which was don't invest in fiber, to due to Google Fiber and a few other things, kind of in the mid part of the last decade, saying, oh my God, if we don't invest in fiber, we're simply going to go out of business. So that drove a lot of investment. We don't have fiber everywhere we used to have copper. And the copper retirement, by the way, is not really about, it is absolutely helpful. And I wish it had been done earlier, because it did force a certain amount of investment in things that we really don't want people to be investing in anymore. But it's not really changing the game. And what we're going to replace the copper in a lot of places with a wireless thing, which is not bad, but it's not about build.
Yeah, Blair, do you see anything that, if those are sort of good but not as impactful changes, are there any big changes that either the FCC or Congress could undertake that would be more impactful?
That's a great question. And I think the answer, I can't think of one, but maybe somebody else can. My creative powers are diminishing over time.
Yeah, but it's interesting. Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, not to answer that question from a Wall Street perspective, but I guess from just a competitive entry perspective, if you have similar situated competitors that are operating the same market and one is subject to a different regulatory scheme than another, it does create artificial barriers to competition if one competitor is subject to less onerous regulations than another, right? And so it's not really a Wall Street investment question, but it's more, at one point does regulation impede fair competition? That's not to say all regulation is bad, but regulation should be examined to ensure that it's consistent with the times. And I think it needs to be not only within the FCC as they're doing in terms of their own regulation, but looking at it from a competitive market perspective to identify the companies in competition and to determine whether there are artificial entry barriers and regulatory barriers. So one specific issue that comes to mind is in the video competition space is that, similar players are subject to different regulations. The legacy regulations require cable companies to have carry local broadcast stations and provide public access channels, which streaming services have no obligations of that kind. Broadcasters and cable are subject to strict ownership limits, capping the number of stations or subscribers to a single company can own. There seems to be a lot of regulatory oversight of the FCC, and there isn't really similar regulatory oversight or requirements on kind of emerging technology. So I think from an innovation and an entry perspective, companies do look at regulatory barriers and burdens when they enter marketplaces. And so if there is an evenness in that regard, I think it would impact competition.
I don't think it will impact competition at all. But, the reasonable minds can differ about that. I would simply say, I think it's a really great argument for Nexstar to make that they have limits and YouTube and TikTok don't. My question to you is simply, have you seen any Wall Street report that says, as a result of what Carr is going to do probably later in September to increase the national cap, that TikTok and YouTube now have a new competitive threat? I don't think so.
Well, right. But I guess it depends on the question you're asking. The question I'm asking is not about Wall Street. My question is, it's
about competition. And Wall Street is very focused on competition.
Right. But we also look at it from a consumer perspective. So will consumers seize lower prices or higher speeds or more innovation if regulations are streamlined and are not serving as an entry barrier? So I think
the national broadcast, why does Nexstar want to buy Tegna? it is not to lower cost to consumers. That's not what they're telling Wall Street. It's about having greater leverage over MVPDs and getting a bigger share of that pie. So I'm not arguing with changing the rules, which are very, very old and reflect a very different video marketplace. I'm just making the point that the arguments in Washington about we're finally going to be able to compete with the big tech streaming platforms, I don't know. Like, no one on Wall Street thinks that, but good thing to say inside the Beltway, but not really relevant to consumers or anything else.
Yeah. But maybe that goes to Joe's original question. I don't think that much that is being talked about in DC is going to change the dynamic in Wall Street in terms of where the investment dollars go. So I agree with Blair's point, but I do think that there's value from the policy perspective in changing how the services are treated, and agree with Stefana's point there that there are value in fixing the policy aspects and removing barriers. I certainly have no interest in taking the existing regime and layering it onto streaming companies. That might not be perceived as beneficial in the Wall Street if we all of a sudden said, hey, let's have all these burdens onto tech companies. I don't think they'll appreciate that as much. But I think the opposite is so we should get rid of those burdens that make no longer any sense. I don't know that it really does much for broadcast offerings to be sustainable for the future. That's for the market to decide. I probably have a different view than the current administration. I suspect where the broadcast is going to be able to grow, whether you have these burdens or not. But that's a consumer issue. That's a good are they able to market reaching more of America for advertising dollars and MVP dollars and retrans dollars? That's a possibility. I don't know that that's going to change the overall path for their life, but there are great things the commission can do on rights of way, pole attachments, NEPA, all those things. It does matter, though, to Blair, it does matter to the point of when the market is approached, right? If you miss a building season because it's going to take you an extra 5 months to get in to some areas, specifically in the Midwest and in the North because of the weather, well, that makes your decisions where you put dollars. It changes that formula. And so I do think it matters for the policy can influence where the dollars are spent and what it matters for consumer perspective. I don't know that it changes the dynamic of the value of the company and where Wall Street, whether they spend dollars on investing, they want to see companies invest in new technologies, or they want to do stock buybacks. I don't know that it changes that dynamic, but I do think it matters for the overall health of the companies going forward. If you want to look in that perspective.
Yeah, Shane, can I bring you in here on the video point? I think one of the biggest, we're talking about all this new bandwidth that all these different technologies are creating, but one of the biggest uses of that is streaming video that is competing with the traditional linear cable video service. And so there's lots of different ways you can focus your attention these days, more so than in the past. And so different markets have arisen around that. But that's also another area where the regulations, I think both Blair and Mike and Svetlana were all alluding to this, is that the regulations on cable companies are a lot different than the ones facing streaming technologies. And so what do you make of that?
Yeah, the attention economy definitely is different, generation by generation. And one thing when you listen to the company earnings calls is that they see this as sort of an age of convergence, and there is a blurring of what they think of as their classic customer. And so they have to look at this from the perspective of, what is it that they're ultimately doing? The old school, the stuff that we started out with, the people that used to be the MCIs of the world, they don't want to just be the telephone company anymore. They want to be in all of these spaces, doing whatever it is that the consumers are going to want to have connectivity. Sometimes they have layering effects into the decisions they've made, where they're actually developing and creating content. And in some cases, they're just as happy to be buying the content from someone else and bringing it to the consumer. So the consumers have a lot of opportunity for choices, and companies are trying to decide the most efficient way to get that to them and then make better choices along the way of what it is that those eyeballs are interested and hungry to see.
If I had a tagline, Joe, I would say, get rid of most of the 1992 Cable Act. Almost everything should be junked. I probably wouldn't mess with retrans, maybe even program access, I guess. But there's most of it should go by the wayside. It makes no longer any sense in the prism that we have as we look at the market today.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, that we have this age of convergence around video, and that it doesn't really make sense to say, let's take this old morass that maybe made sense in the 90s and for cable and put it onto streamers. Why not say, let's get rid of all that and put everyone on a level playing field that way? Well, I want to turn now to the subject of, we talked a little bit about mergers before, but more specifically about broadband mergers, sort of what are the pros and cons, and what should we expect there as we have, all these new companies out there. It's a capital intensive market. Can the market sustain, 5 or 6 different fiber providers in one city, as I think, Mike, you were talking about earlier? Or would consumers be better off by, mergers that create larger companies that have economies of scale and that kind of thing? Mike, let's go to you first on that.
Okay, sure. Look, it depends on the market. I think, I think there's going to be some consolidation in the broadcast space. Whether that has big implications for the overall market, I'm not sure. I think there's going to be, at some point, after all the money from the subsidies for the unserved marketplace, the BEAD dollars are actually spent. I think there's going to be massive consolidation in the rural broadband offering. A lot of those companies are not going to survive, and they're going to get gobbled up. But again, I think that's really small potatoes for the market at large. I don't think it really changes that much. Now, the bigger deals, even though we're in a more receptive administration. I mean, nothing could be less receptive than the Biden administration in terms of mergers, which basically said, don't bring your merger forward. I think the Trump administration has said, hey, we intend to be more open and more welcoming to mergers and deals, and have certain conditions on how that's going to play out. I'm just not sure that any of those deals make any sense. We always talked about a cable company buying a wireless provider, or the other way around. I'm not sure that plays anymore. The big deals that were thought about or hypothesized in the past, they may not materialize going forward. And you have some limitations because some of the providers have perspectives that may not sell well with this administration. And so they have to keep that in mind. So some of the big players probably couldn't get approval without a very contentious process. So I'm of the mind that you're going to see a market that it's going to have mergers. There's going to be activity in that space, but it's probably not the big time ones that people envisioned in the past. I don't know if Blair agrees with that.
Agree in part, disagree in part. Clearly, there's going to be a lot of broadcast mergers. What you alluded to is that Wall Street wonders, with good reason, whether Disney and Comcast will be allowed to participate either as a seller or a buyer. Not for any kind of competition or even public interest, as we usually use that term, but simply for political reasons. What will be the Trump transaction cost to those things, right? I absolutely disagree with the assessment that the Biden administration didn't allow any mergers through. That's not accurate. They certainly were tougher, and some deals were allowed to go through and some weren't. So, but it was not a total shutdown of the mergers. And as we recently, heard from the former deputy at the DOJ in the antitrust division, it's not at all clear that antitrust, as it is commonly understood, is the motivating factor for whether a deal gets approved or not, as we saw with the HP, what happened with the HP merger, where they went around the antitrust division and using political influence. And again, this is according to the former Trump official, to get a transaction done. So there's lots of questions about these mergers. But again, the broadcast mergers, those are definitely happening. Here's some other deals that are happening. The cable channels are going to merge. And those are actually in tension from an economic perspective. But you also see there's going to be a few more mergers on the cable side. Charter Cox will be approved. Altice will eventually be sold. And so you'll basically have two very large cable companies. There will be a roll-up, probably a little bit later in the decade, and Mike, you alluded to this, of lots of different smaller fiber companies. Not clear whether AT&T or Verizon or T-Mobile is going to do it. The one thing Wall Street has a big debate about is whether wireless companies should be buying more wired facilities, so as both to lower their cost structure, but also to keep people on a bigger bundle so as to reduce churn. So I think you're going to see activity there as well. But, you know, if you look at what we think of as the big five, AT&T, Verizon, T-Mobile, Charter, and Comcast, a few years ago, there was a lot of discussion of whether T-Mobile would buy or merge with Charter or even Comcast. I think because of some of the trends that have been discussed, that's less possible now, and I don't see a lot of interest in that. But that's the last big deal that people I think are talking about. The other ones are more kind of fill-in.
Yeah, and I think, Mike, you and Blair both mentioned that maybe these bigger deals are less likely to happen. But do you mean that they're less likely to happen from a business consumer perspective, or is it the regulatory barriers that are the biggest barrier? That not being in political favor with the people who need to approve your merger, or is it a mix of both, perhaps?
I'd say it's a mix of both. You know, it depends on the case, the scenario. The market doesn't seem to be receptive to some of the deals, and in other cases, there's companies probably can't get their deal through. So it's probably a little bit of both.
I would also add that one of the challenges we've had with the change in the administration is just the uncertainty on how much of this money is eventually going to get more people connected. So you had the Biden administration that was fiber forward, and they were spending a lot of money on the planning on that, like a 10-year infrastructure plan. And now we've switched over to how expediently can we get more capability into people's hands, and those not necessarily needed to be fiber, but other things. And so that's one of the reasons why Wall Street doesn't care as much about as much. It is they're not in charge of the money, and they're trying to figure out who is going to fund this and when and where do they need to do a gap filling exercise for those areas that they see possibility. And those don't tend to be Wall Street people. Those are VC guys. There's people out in the areas where they just don't see connectivity, but they see that people want and have an interest in access. So there's a lot of things in play there, rather than it's not just regulation and straight up cash flow.
Yeah, good points there. I think we're coming up on time, so I want to get to audience questions. So remember to use the Slido link to put in any questions that you might have. I see one right now that is about, we've mostly avoided talking about BEAD, but any DC broadband discussion is not complete without a discussion of BEAD. And this audience member asks, we've seen several broadband companies pull back their plans to invest after winning RDOF auctions. Won't the same thing happen with BEAD? I don't know who wants to jump in first on that.
I'll jump in. Okay, it's a thin pool. Look, I defend RDOF, and if 2/3 of the money has been widely receptive and as being built out. Networks are being built out because of it. About 1/3 of it, and there's specific cases why some of it hasn't moved forward, and usually by company basis. And there's also changing economics. Inflation rates shot up, labor costs went up. There are a lot of different things that made the math for the reverse auction no longer makes some sense in certain markets. And so that wasn't not unanticipated and anticipated. So there are things you can do to fix the reverse auction, but I think it was a wide success. And for the third left, we're now into BEAD, and BEAD's going to have, I think, similar take. There are going to be a lot of companies who are going to do some great outcomes. No process is going to be perfect, especially that run that's kind of somewhat by state beauty contests, in terms of how they're scoring and who wins and how they pick their winners. There's going to be failure, and some of that's going to, still have to be addressed going forward. What I think that the issue is from public policy perspective, and I touched upon it earlier, is that we're getting the benefit of the bargain. We're getting a deal where BEAD is being pushed to be stretched for less cost. We're going to have expanded options of new technology. What I worry about is there's a case of Arkansas where they're able to, for the allocation of $1 billion, they believe that they can offer service to everybody for $300 million. And so what happens to that $700 million? I believe that money should go back to the Treasury, and we're going to have that policy debate because we're going to need that money later on when some of these companies fail, which is inevitable in my mind.
We also have the elimination of the mandates, the workforce development, climate change resilience, net neutrality, and extensive community engagement. That was all part of the previous administration. It added a layer of complexity to the planning process, as well as the fact that we had just a lack of sequencing understanding of where's the fiber going to come from, who's going to lay the fiber, are the people actually trained in doing this, which was God bless the people that put all that effort into those original BEAD plans, trying to get through those multiple hurdles. Now the hurdles have been removed, and you have people that are frustrated because they felt like they played the game fairly from the first round. Second round is being played differently, and the cost may come down on this. We may get things a little faster. Part of the challenge, with as much as we all want to love fiber, is the ability to try to put fiber in the ground isn't actually making things fast. It's making things more cumbersome. So the idea of getting more connectivity to people more efficiently, I think, will play very well for those who have been lagging in this area. And we'll see that we'll see how these plans come out in the next, what do they do, September 4th?
Well, they're all going public this week because you have to have a 7-day comment period. But yeah, they'll be then turned into NTIA on the 4th.
So much more to come on BEAD, I'm sure. Let's try to get in one more audience question. This question asks, with convergence and USF, that's Universal Service Fund reform, should changes to USF have subsidies be more technology neutral, like BEAD? Does current USF favor any one technology?
Okay, so the short answer is yes, it does favor certain technologies because on who the traditional recipients are. High cost funds tend to go to rural broadband companies, rural fiber companies, rural telephone companies, depending on your definition. They tend to, there's money that goes to rural cellular companies and wireless companies. So the money now goes to different companies and is on that path. The USF is going to have to fix the distribution model. And when people talk about USF reform, it can't just be about contributions. You have to fix distribution, and making it technology neutral or addressing the flaws of the current system absolutely have to be addressed. But right now it does favor certain technologies, and they're going to have to be fixed.
I think the bigger political question is, why do we have universal service? Now, I'm in favor of continuing the program, particularly for low income and some institutional support. But the whole point of BEAD was to essentially end the need for new deployment into unserved and underserved areas. One of the curiosities of BEAD, and that would be a whole other thing, is what the administration did was this really cute little accounting trick where it said, for purposes of mapping unserved and unserved areas, we're not going to count satellite. But for purposes of qualifying as served and unserved, we're going to count satellite. But that raises the question, what do the states get when they give money to the satellite companies that they don't already have today? We could go into what the satellite companies say, but my point is, if you think satellite solves the problem, then pretty much everybody's covered. We still have a low income problem. We still have an institutional problem. But the bulk of USF spending overall many years has been on deployment. And if you think satellite is sufficient, then isn't the problem already solved?
And Blair raises an interesting point about how this plays out going forward. And BEAD, a decision was made by public policy in the infrastructure law that that we don't fund OpEx. That the issue is supposedly solved, and this is going to work to our advantage. And there's going to be a fight going forward of what do we do with OpEx costs? And I'm telling you, there's not enough money in universal service to pay for OpEx for BEAD. So that crash is going to happen at some point. And I suggest to you right now, there's not a universe where OpEx is coming for BEAD builds. And we're going to have to deal with that going forward. And but
if you include satellite, if you think that satellite is an adequate substitute, you don't need to provide them OpEx, do you?
No, I'm agreeing. I'm of the same mind, is that the companies are going to beg for OpEx that are getting the builds now and saying, fiber companies are saying, hey, we can build it. We should build it. We're the best technology. Oh, by the way, you got to give us OpEx later. We're just going to ask for it with a different administration. That's a problem. Satellite is absolutely great technology, but it goes back to your earlier point: is it a substitute or not?
Well, if you think it's a substitute, then I don't know what we're spending money on. And a lot of states are, one reason why, one of the things I think people have missed in the BEAD calculus is maybe the most significant thing that the administration did was not the technicality, but to have a much lower threshold for what's an excessive cost. Because once you lower that number enough, the Western states basically have to do satellite, a lot of satellite. And what you're seeing is the Southeastern and basically the Eastern states are trying to do a little bit less fiber, but fundamentally do what they did the first time. Whereas in the West, it's just a lot more is going to go to satellite because you can't fund the so-called excessive costs.
All right. Any final thoughts from Shane or Svetlana? Otherwise, I'm sure that this conversation will carry on. Sorry, Shane.
No, I just say I'm a fan of take all comers on the technology. I think that the government deciding who should the winner could be was part of our problem in this last round.
Yeah, certainly, and I think the development of all these new technologies is important to the VEED discussion, but also is creating more competition throughout the country, and it's certainly going to be interesting to watch the market develop going forward. So with that, I think we'll stop for now today. Thank you so much to our panelists, and thank you all for watching.
Thanks, Joe.